The morning my husband's sister moved into our guest room, she carried exactly 3 suitcases and a small plant I later learned she had stolen from her previous landlord. I didn't know about the plant at the time. That detail came later, the way most details about Renee came later, slowly, in pieces, each one slightly more alarming than the last. My name is Catherine. I'm 51 years old. I've been married to Paul for 23 years. We have one son, James, who is 19 and currently studying engineering at a university 4 hours away, a fact I am now deeply grateful for. I work as a senior financial analyst for a regional hospital system. I have done this work for 18 years. It is not glamorous work. It involves spreadsheets, budget projections, compliance reviews, and the particular kind of careful attention that most people find tedious, and I find deeply satisfying. Numbers don't lie. Numbers don't have agendas. Numbers simply tell you where things stand. I should have applied that same principle to people earlier than I did. Paul owns a landscaping business he started 15 years ago with a used truck and a borrowed mower. He works hard. He is genuinely good at what he does. The business has grown to 12 employees and a client list that includes 3 commercial properties and a school district. He is proud of what he built, and he should be. What Paul is not good at, what he has never been particularly good at, is saying no to his family. His mother cannot say anything he disagrees with. His uncle calls him for money every few years, and Paul always finds a way to help. And Renee, his younger sister by 7 years, has spent her entire adult life cycling through situations that require rescue, and Paul has spent his entire adult life providing it. I knew this about him when I married him. I want to be honest about that. I didn't discover it afterward. It was always there, this instinct in him to absorb other people's problems, to stand between his family and consequences they had usually brought on themselves. I had thought, when we were younger, that it was generosity. I was not entirely wrong, but generosity without limits is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability, and people who recognize it in someone will use it until there is nothing left. Renee had been using it for years. The situation that led to her moving in was, by her account, straightforward. Her landlord had raised the rent. The increase was, she said, unconscionable. She had been unable to find another apartment she could afford on her salary, which she described vaguely as insufficient for the current market. She needed a place to stay while she got back on her feet. Paul told me about it on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing a budget report on my laptop at the kitchen table. He sat down across from me. He said, "Renee needs to stay with us for a little while." I asked how long. He said, "A couple of months." I looked at him. I want to say I argued. I want to say I laid out all the reasons this was a bad idea. All the things I knew about Renee and her history and the way time estimates involving his sister had a consistent tendency to expand beyond recognition. I want to say I put my foot down immediately. I didn't. I said, "Okay, but we need to set some ground rules." Paul said, "Of course, absolutely." We did not set ground rules, or rather, Paul agreed with every rule I proposed and then somehow never communicated any of them to Renee. So she arrived 3 days later with her 3 suitcases and her stolen plant and absolutely no awareness that any expectations existed. The first week was fine. Renee was pleasant. She cooked dinner twice. She complimented my kitchen. She and Paul sat up late talking about their childhood, and I could hear them laughing from our bedroom, and I thought, this is fine. People are complicated. She is his sister. This is what families do. The second week, things began to shift. She started sleeping until 10 in the morning, which was her business, except that she had told us she was actively job hunting, and I had begun to notice that she was not, in any observable way, actively job hunting. Her laptop remained closed. Her phone was always in her hand, but never, as far as I could tell, being used to apply for anything. When I mentioned it gently to Paul, he said, "She's going through a lot. Give her some time." I gave her time. The third week, she rearranged our living room. I came home from work to find the couch against a different wall and the armchair facing a different direction, and a collection of what appeared to be her decorative items arranged on our bookshelf where my books had been. My books were in a neat stack on the floor. I moved my books back. The next morning, they were on the floor again. I asked Paul about this. He looked mildly uncomfortable and said, "She was just trying to make it feel more like home." I said, "It is my home." He said, "I know, I'll talk to her." He talked to her, she cried, he felt terrible. The books remained on the floor for another week before I simply moved them myself and did not discuss it further. I want to be precise about something here, because I think it matters. Renee never did anything enormous in those early weeks. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that is the outrage. That is the moment everything changed. What she did was accumulate small things: a rearranged room, a comment about my work hours, a question about how much I made, asked so casually over dinner that I almost answered before I caught myself, a remark to Paul, which I overheard from the hallway, that she didn't know how he lived with so much tension in the house. Tension, as though the tension had arrived independently of her. I had been working in finance long enough to recognize a particular pattern. It is the pattern of someone who is preparing a story. Not necessarily consciously, some people are deliberate about it, others simply have such a long history of positioning themselves as the reasonable party in every conflict that it has become instinct, as natural as breathing. Renee was, I believe, the second kind. She genuinely experienced herself as reasonable. The rearranged bookshelf was her trying to help. The question about my salary was innocent curiosity. The remark about tension was sincere concern. What she could not see, or chose not to see, was the effect of those things accumulated together. By the end of the first month, she had begun involving herself in our finances. It started with the grocery shopping. She had offered to do it, which I appreciated, and I had given her a budget and a list. She returned without several things on the list and with several things that were not on it, and when I looked at the receipt, she had spent $80 more than I had given her. I asked her about it. She said, I just thought we could try some different things. The usual stuff is so boring. I said, I gave you a budget. She said, it was barely enough. Things are expensive now. You know how it is. I said, I set that budget because I track our household expenses carefully. I know exactly how much we spend on groceries each month. She gave me a look, a small, patient look. The kind of look that means you are being unreasonable, but I am going to be kind about it. She said, I'll try to stick to it next time. She did not stick to it next time. I mentioned it to Paul. He said, she's trying to help. Just let her do the shopping. It's not a big deal. I said, it becomes a big deal if we let her establish the expectation that budgets are suggestions. He said, you're being rigid? That was new. In 23 years of marriage, Paul had said many things to me during disagreements. He had said I was overthinking things. He had said I was being too analytical. He had never, before Renee arrived, said I was being rigid. I noticed that. The month 2, she got a job. I was genuinely relieved. The job was at a home goods store, part-time, not what she had described as her career goals, but it was income and it was a schedule, and I thought perhaps now things would normalize. Instead, things accelerated. The job gave Renee money, which she spent. It also gave her a schedule, which she apparently interpreted as proof that she was contributing, which gave her more confidence to offer opinions about how our household should be run. She started commenting on our spending. Not in the way Diane had, not overtly critical, but in that sideways manner that is somehow worse because it's harder to address directly. She would look at Paul when I mentioned buying something and raise her eyebrows slightly. She would say things like, wow, that's a lot for a jacket, and when I said I'd had the same jacket for 6 years and it was a replacement, she would nod thoughtfully as if processing new information. She asked Paul in front of me whether we had thought about refinancing the house. She had heard rates were good. She suggested, again in front of me, that Paul should consider expanding the business by taking on a partner who could handle the financial side. Since managing money and managing a business were really two different skill sets, that one landed differently than the others. I looked at Paul when she said it. He was looking at his dinner. I said, Paul has me for the financial side. She smiled. I know. I just mean a dedicated business person, someone whose whole focus is the company. I said, my whole focus is finance. It's what I do professionally. She said, I know, but you're busy with your own work. It must be hard to give his business the attention it deserves on top of everything else. Paul said nothing. I excused myself from the table. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a long time. I was not angry, exactly. Anger felt too clean, too simple for what I was feeling. What I was feeling was something more like recognition. The slow recognition of a pattern that had been building for 2 months and that I had been, with my characteristic tendency toward patience, allowing to build. I thought about James, our son, who had called me the previous week and asked carefully, is everything okay at home? I'd said yes. He'd said, Aunt Renee posted something on social media about how much she loved living with you guys. It seemed like she was planning to stay. I thought about my grocery budget, running consistently over for 6 weeks. I thought about my books, which were currently in their correct place on the shelf because I had put them there 3 times. I thought about the word rigid, which Paul had used about me once and which I had heard Renee use about me twice since then in conversations I was not meant to hear. I thought about the comment about a financial partner for the business and the way Paul had looked at his dinner. And I thought, I need to understand exactly what is happening here. The next morning, I did what I do when I need to understand something. I gathered information. I pulled up our joint account records for the past 8 weeks. I went through every transaction carefully. What I found was not dramatic. It was, in its way, worse than dramatic. It was a slow and consistent drift. Grocery overages, a streaming subscription Renee had added to our account without mentioning it, a charge from a restaurant I didn't recognize, on a night Paul had told me he was working late. Not a large amount, not a smoking gun, just a pattern of small assumptions, small additions, small costs that no one had asked about because no one had expected to be asked. I kept the records. I also called a friend of mine named Deborah, who had been through a version of this with her brother-in-law 3 years earlier. She listened to everything I told her. When I finished, she said, "How long has she been there?" I said, 9 weeks, she said. And when was the last time Paul sided with you in front of her? I thought about it. I said, I'm not sure he has. Deborah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the problem. Not the grocery overages, not the bookshelf. That's the problem. I already knew that, somewhere, but hearing it said clearly made it easier to hold. That evening, after Renee went to her room, I asked Paul if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table. I had the account records in front of me, not as an accusation, as information. I told him what I had found. I walked him through the overages, the added subscription, the restaurant charge. He looked at the records. He said, the restaurant was a work dinner. I mentioned it. I said, you didn't mention it? He said, I'm sure I did. I said, Paul, I track our accounts carefully. I would have noted it. You didn't mention it. He looked uncomfortable. He said, it was one dinner. I said, I know. I'm not talking about the dinner. I'm talking about a pattern of small things that nobody asks about, and I'm telling you that I've noticed the pattern and I want us to talk about it. He said, you're making this bigger than it is. I said, I'm making it exactly as big as it is. Not bigger, exactly. He looked at me. There was something in his expression I didn't recognize immediately. It took me a moment to name it. It was not irritation, not exactly. It was discomfort. The specific discomfort of someone who has been carefully not looking at something and is now being asked to look directly at it. I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. He said, okay. I said, do you think I'm rigid? He looked away. I said, Paul. He said, sometimes you can be very particular about things. I said, I'm particular about our finances because I am a financial analyst, and managing money carefully is something I am both professionally and personally committed to. Is that rigid? He said, when it makes people feel criticized, maybe. I said, who feels criticized? He didn't answer. I said, I need you to hear what I'm saying. Renee is not a guest anymore. She is making decisions in this house. She is spending money that isn't hers without asking. She is influencing how you see me. And I need to know whether you see that, because if you don't see it, I'm not sure how we talk about it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think you're being unfair to her. I said, okay. I stood up. He said, where are you going? I said, to think. I went to our bedroom and I sat with what he had said. I am being unfair to her. I thought about my books on the floor. I thought about the grocery budget, ignored 6 times. I thought about the subscription charge, added without a word. I thought about Paul looking at his dinner when his sister implied I was not capable of supporting his business. I thought about rigid. I thought about tension. And I made a decision. Not an angry decision. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. What I did next was not revenge, and it was not a tantrum, and it was not, as Paul later described it to Renee, an overreaction. It was a decision made calmly by a person who had spent 23 years managing money carefully and who had decided that it was time to manage it differently. The next morning, I went to our bank. I spoke with our branch manager, a man named Thomas who I had worked with for many years. I told him I wanted to separate my direct deposit from the joint account. He nodded and made the change. I told him I wanted to review which accounts were solely mine and which were joint. We went through them together. My personal savings account, which I had maintained independently since before the marriage, was already separate. My investment portfolio, which I had built quietly over the years from my salary and a modest inheritance from my grandmother, was also separate. What was not separate was a significant portion of my monthly paycheck, which I had been routing into our joint account for years as a contribution to household expenses. That contribution had grown over the years as my salary had grown. Paul knew I contributed, he did not know precisely how much. I redirected my direct deposit. I also reviewed the automatic payments I had set up over the years. Some of them I had established to cover expenses that Paul assumed were handled by the business or by some automatic process he had never needed to think about. Our life insurance premiums, for example, which I had been paying from my personal account for 3 years after Paul's business went through a difficult period, and he had let the joint payment lapse without mentioning it. I did not cancel those payments. I would never compromise our family's actual security over a conflict with my husband. What I did was document them, every one, every payment I had made, every transfer I had initiated, every coverage I had maintained. I organized it into a file the way I would organize a client's financial history, clearly labeled, chronological, complete. Then I went to work and had a normal day. When I got home, Renee was in the kitchen making tea. She smiled at me. Paul's truck was not in the driveway. I said, "When is your lease up at your old apartment?" She looked at me. "I found a new place, remember? The landlord raised the rent." I said, "I know. I mean, when does your current lease end? Your obligation at your old place?" She said, "I don't have one. I was month to month." I said, "So you could have stayed." She said, "The rent increase was unreasonable." I said, "How much was it?" She said, "What?" I said, "How much did the rent go up?" She named a figure. I thought about that figure. I thought about what she was currently contributing to our household, which was nothing except the grocery overages and the streaming subscription she had added without asking. I said, "That's less than what you would contribute here if you were paying proportional rent." She stared at me. I said, "I'm not asking you to pay rent. I'm making an observation." Paul came home 20 minutes later. He found Renee in the living room and me at the kitchen table with my laptop. Dinner was not on the stove. I had not made dinner. This was unusual. I almost always made dinner. He said, "Should we order something?" I said, "That sounds fine. I'll pay for my own." He looked at me. I said, "I've separated my direct deposit. My paycheck no longer goes into the joint account." The room was very quiet. He said, "What?" I said, "I've been contributing a significant portion of my salary to our joint account every month. I've redirected that while we work some things out. The mortgage is covered. The utilities are covered. Everything essential is covered. But the discretionary income that I've been adding is no longer going to be there." He said, "You can't just do that without talking to me." I said, "I tried to talk to you last night. You told me I was being unfair to your sister." Renee stood in the doorway of the kitchen. I looked at her. I said, "Renee, I think it would be helpful for Paul and me to have some privacy." She looked at Paul. He looked at me. I said, again calmly, "Renee, please." She went upstairs. Paul sat down. I opened the file I had prepared. I placed it on the table between us. I said, "I want to show you something." For the next hour, I walked him through it. The way I had walked Renee through the grocery overages. The way I had been walking clients through their own financial histories for 18 years. Calmly, methodically, without drama. I showed him the life insurance premiums. His expression when he understood that I had been paying them for 3 years without his knowledge was something I will not easily forget. I showed him the transfers I had made during slow seasons in his business. Not all of them, not the full picture, just enough for him to begin to see the shape of it. I showed him the household budget with and without my contribution. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "I didn't know any of this." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I didn't need credit. I needed a partner, and I thought we were one." He looked at me. I said, "I need to know whether we still are. Because what I've watched happen over the last 9 weeks is your sister moving into this house and gradually repositioning you to see me as a problem. And I need to know whether that's working." He said, "That's not what's happening." I said, "She rearranged our living room. She has spent over our grocery budget every single week. She added a subscription to our account without asking. She suggested in front of me that you needed someone else to handle your business finances. And every time I have raised any of these things with you, you have told me I was overreacting." He looked at the table. I said, "I'm not overreacting, Paul. I'm an exceptionally experienced financial analyst who has been quietly managing our household finances for 23 years. I am not overreacting to a grocery budget." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I think I've been a bad husband lately." It was not an excuse. It was not a deflection. It was just a statement, said quietly, to the table. I said, yes, a little bit. He almost smiled, then he didn't. He said, I didn't realize how much you were doing. I said, I know. That's not your fault entirely. I should have been more transparent. But I also needed you to trust me without seeing every number. He said, I do trust you. I said, you didn't act like it. He couldn't argue with that. We sat at the kitchen table for another hour, not arguing, talking, actually talking, in the way we had not talked in several months. I told him things I had not told him, specific numbers, specific contributions, the full picture of what I had been managing. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked like a man who had just been handed a document he hadn't known existed and was trying to understand how it could have been right in front of him all along. He said, what do you need from me? I said, I need Renee to have a move-out date. He was quiet. I said, not immediately, not cruelly, but a date, 60 days. Enough time for her to find somewhere to go. Enough time for her to do it properly. He said, she'll be upset? I said, probably. He said, she'll blame you. I said, she already does. He thought about that. Then he said, okay, one word. But I had been married to Paul for 23 years, and I knew the weight of his okay. This one meant he had decided something. He talked to Renee the next morning. I was not in the room. I sat in our bedroom with a cup of coffee, and I could not hear the conversation, but I could hear the shape of it. It lasted about 20 minutes. There was a period of raised voices, Renee's, not Paul's, then quiet, then a door. Paul came upstairs. He said, 60 days. She agreed. I said, thank you. He sat next to me on the bed. He said, she cried. I said, I know. He said, I know you're not glad about that. I said, of course not. She's your sister. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she said you were always difficult. I said, I know she thinks that. He said, I told her she was wrong. I looked at him. He said, I told her she hadn't seen you when things were actually difficult. Because when things were difficult, you just quietly handled it without anyone knowing. That one took me a moment. He said, I'm sorry it took me this long to say that out loud. In the end, Renee left in 53 days, not 60. She found a place, a 2-bedroom apartment with a friend from her job, and she moved out on a Saturday morning without a lot of ceremony. She hugged Paul for a long time. She and I said goodbye politely. The stolen plant went with her. The week after she left, Paul and I did something we had not done in a long time. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner and went through our finances together. Every account, every budget line. I showed him the full picture the way I had been managing it, and we talked about what we wanted it to look like going forward. He was surprised by some of it, not because I had hidden anything, because he had simply trusted me to handle it and had never asked to see it. We agreed on some changes. We agreed on transparency. We agreed on a monthly review, just the two of us, going through the numbers together the way I go through numbers with my clients. James called that weekend. I told him things were better. He said, I'm glad. He paused. Was it Aunt Renee? I said, a little bit. He said, I figured. I asked him how he knew. He said, because she kept posting about how great it was to live with you, and you never once mentioned it. I thought about that. The things we don't say and the things they tell. I said, we're fine now. Come home sometime soon. He said, I will. 2 things stayed with me from that whole period, and I want to tell them to you because I think they matter. The first is this: the most dangerous financial problems in a marriage are never the ones you can see clearly. They are the ones that accumulate in the margins, the small assumptions, the redirected budgets, the things nobody asks about because everybody assumes somebody else is handling them. The way to prevent those problems is not to be suspicious. It is to be transparent, to show each other the numbers, to make sure both people understand what both people are contributing. The second is this: I never went to that bank to punish Paul. I went because I needed him to understand something that he could not understand while it was invisible to him. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do in a relationship is make the invisible visible. Not as a weapon, as information. Paul and I celebrated our 24th anniversary last spring. We went to the same restaurant where we had celebrated our 15th, the one with the good bread and the slightly too loud music, and the waiter who always remembers that Paul takes his coffee without sugar. On the way home, Paul said, I've been thinking. I said, about what? He said, I want to understand our finances better, the whole picture, not just the summary. I said, I'd like that. He said, will you show me? I said, I've been waiting years for you to ask. He laughed. I laughed. We drove home in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had come close to losing each other and had chosen, deliberately, not to. That choice is available every day. It is not always easy. It is always worth it. Thank you for listening.